you let me once again remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the chamber and across the campus. Please take care to observe these measures over the course of this afternoon's business, including when entering and exiting the chamber. The next item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on his report on coronavirus legislation. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, since my statement in this chamber and our second report on the 11th of August, additional measures intended to bring COVID-19 back under control as we enter winter have come into force. The measures in the UK Coronavirus Act and the two Scottish Acts continue to be an important part of our response to the continuing significant public health risk and economic challenges posed by the pandemic. Today I have laid before Parliament the third report on the provisions in both Scottish Acts and the UK Act, which covers a reporting period which ended on the 30th of September. In addition to the reporting requirements under the legislation, we have also reported in more detail on 22 provisions which we have judged to be of most significant impact and interest. We've also reported on a total of 49 SSIs where the main purpose relates to coronavirus as required under Section 14 of the Second Scottish Act. We have fulfilled the requirement to take account of available information about the nature and the number of incidents of domestic abuse occurred during the reporting period, and also included examples of the Scottish Government's wider action to support women and children at risk of or experiencing domestic abuse. This includes additional funding of £4.25 million for organisations working on the front line across Scotland to allow services to be upscaled. In the report, we have also included information on rights and equality impacts. This is key to ensuring that human rights are respected, protected and fulfilled, and equality objectives are achieved. We will continue to work to consider carefully recommendations and best practice coming from the work that is being undertaken by the Parliament, stakeholders and others to ensure that human rights, children's rights and equality are protected at this difficult time. In my statement on our second report, I announced our intention to extend, through regulations subject to the will of the Parliament, the expiry date of the Scottish Acts to the 31st of March 2021. I also announced we would seek to expire, through regulations, provisions which were deemed to be no longer necessary. Both sets of regulations came into force on the 29th of September, and separate regulations have also been made to suspend provisions relating to vulnerable adults and to Muirburn, which are not currently required, but may be required at a future point. This approach to extension, suspension and expiry of provisions in the Scottish Acts is proportionate and appropriate to the scale of the ongoing risks posed by the coronavirus and reflects our commitment that provisions would not remain in place unless necessary. Let me now, however, turn to the provisions of the UK Coronavirus Act. As required by the UK Act, the House of Commons undertook a review of its non-devolved provisions after 6 months of operation. On the 30th of September, the motion that the temporary provisions of the Coronavirus Act should not yet expire was approved. The devolved provisions in the UK Act were not in scope of that 6 months review, but the Scottish Government has, in our third report, provided information on the operation and status of those provisions. This will provide this Parliament with the opportunity to scrutinise the judgments we have made and to express its view. There are two provisions in particular I want to mention in this context. The UK Secretary of State for Health confirmed last week that the UK Government intends to expire early the temporary provisions in Section 10 and Schedule 8 of the UK Act, which apply to the Mental Health Act 1983 as they apply in England. I and my ministerial colleagues have answered questions on the Scottish Government's approach to our equivalent provisions in this chamber and in committee, and our third report confirms our view that these provisions continue to be necessary. Whilst the equivalent Scottish provisions have not been commenced, they are designed to ensure a person continues to have access to the right level of care and treatment when they are unwell, should the workforce come under severe pressure. The Short Life Mental Health Legislation Commencement Consideration Group have been a vital source of information and intelligence about the impact of COVID-19 on the operation of the Mental Health Care and Treatment Scotland Act 2003, both in the form of formal data collected by the relevant organisations to the more informal evidence of the views of members and practitioners. The group recognises that the mental health impacts of this pandemic and associated lockdown restrictions may not be felt in full for some months. They remain of the view that it is appropriate to retain these provisions on the statute book, as it would not be prudent to leave our services vulnerable given the potential for a second wave of COVID-19 and the approaching winter flu season. Our view is therefore that our provisions in the UK Act relating to mental health remain necessary. I can, however, today confirm that the Scottish Government does now intend to bring forward regulations to suspend the provisions in Section 16 of the UK Act relating to social care needs assessment as they apply to adult services. This follows a further survey of the extent of the operation at a local level of the powers. This has yet again demonstrated that few local authorities have needed to use these powers. However, there are concerns that demands for children's services in particular may increase. These powers, as they apply to children's services, are therefore not being proposed for suspension. Our report again highlights that there are some provisions that have not been commenced, some that have been commenced but have not been used, either extensively or at all, since coming into force. We consider that together these provisions continue to be necessary either as important tools as we progress through the route map, or because they may be required to respond to future resurgence of the virus. The report demonstrates that accountability continues to be integral to our efforts to suppress the virus, and this two-monthly reporting process continues to be a key part of aiding transparency in how the powers have been used. But I want to turn to the issue raised by a number of members about an enhanced role for Parliament in scrutinising coronavirus regulations. I think it's fair to say that within the context of responding to the public health emergency, the Government has made every effort to be accountable to Parliament. The First Minister has appeared regularly to set out the Government's intentions and to be questioned closely. I and my colleagues have appeared on many occasions in plenary and before committees to give evidence. And of course, the First Minister and other ministers attended meetings of this Parliament during the summer recess. There can be no doubt about our commitment to be accountable to Parliament, but we do wish to respond to the calls for enhanced scrutiny. Presiding Officer, I've therefore today written to you, to the party leaders and to the conveners group, asking for nominees to attend a meeting, hopefully this week, to work in collaboration to develop options for what kind of enhanced scrutiny arrangements we can develop. We'll need to be radical in developing a procedure to reflect the reality that public health interventions often have to be brought into force at great pace. Also, when the time comes to remove restrictions, we'll want to remove them from our fellow citizens at the earliest possible opportunity. We must recognise we are dealing with a public health emergency. We must have the ability to act without delay when the clinical advice indicates that urgent interventions are required. Indeed, the changes announced by the UK Government acknowledge this important point. And I'll now take this work forward urgently with the Parliament and those nominated by the parties. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by noting that, as is required by Section 15 of the First Scottish Act and Section 12 of the Second Scottish Act, Scottish ministers have conducted a review of the provisions in Part 1 of these Acts and have prepared this report. We are satisfied that the status of the provisions set out in Part 1 of the Acts as of 30th September remain appropriate. We have also undertaken a review of the SSIs to which Section 14 of the Second Act applies. Scottish ministers are also satisfied that the status of these statutory instruments at the end of the reporting period is appropriate. A review has also been conducted of the provisions of the UK Act for which the Scottish Parliament gave consent, and we are satisfied that the status of those provisions is appropriate. And, Presiding Officer, we welcome the opportunity of engagement with the Parliament as it considers its third report.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press their request to speak button or to press R in the chat function now. And I call Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of his statement and for the report, which, as he indicates, covers the period up to the 30th of September. It's published against the backdrop of further restrictions which were announced on the 22nd of September, with potential additional measures coming tomorrow, which will doubtless raise a number of immediate issues for people and businesses across Scotland. These reports, however, provide an opportunity to take a broader view on issues that have arisen under the legislation during the pandemic. And these benches are particularly pleased to see the emphasis on human rights, given the fact that emergency measures have a significant impact on individuals' liberty. Can I ask him about parliamentary scrutiny? We now have a debate and vote on COVID restrictions on Thursday, and I acknowledge he is here today and has appeared, as have other of his colleagues, before committees and in the chamber many times. But does he believe that the system that this Parliament mandated in March, effectively with retrospective approval of government action, is still fit for purpose?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I've indicated in my statement that I wish to see that system changed, and that's why I've made the proposal to ask people to come together and do so. But the parameters for changing that system have to be understood, and I've made the point too very openly in the statement that when you're dealing with public health emergencies, some of the procedures we have for dealing with secondary legislation are inappropriate. Essentially, the choice lies between presiding officers, you will know, as a committee convener as well, the negative instrument, an affirmative instrument, a super affirmative instrument, and a made affirmative instrument. Now, all of those have their own timetable, and the timetable does not suit regulations that have to be made very quickly. Can we find another way of doing this is the question that I've asked. I am sympathetic to that. That point has been raised by a number of members in this chamber. It has been raised at committee. I think when I appear at the Mr Cameron's committee tomorrow, I think it'll be the 11th occasion on which I have been at that committee. And if we can find a better way to do it, then I'm very happy to find that better way. But he takes a particular lesson from where we are now. Let me suggest another lesson, that we have a considerable distance to go to ensure that this virus is defeated in Scotland. And we must, in the interests of all our fellow citizens, use every tool available to us. So I believe we can make changes that will be appropriate and helpful, and I hope that the other parties and the Parliament will help the government do that.
Thank you. I now call Monica Lynn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for advancing of his statement and welcome his response to calls for enhanced scrutiny, because the public want to understand the reasons behind these powers and restrictions, how their effectiveness is actually evaluated and what the evidence base for them is. Case numbers sadly are now going in the wrong direction, and inconsistencies in guidance and regulations, taking the recent outcry over restrictions on baby and toddler classes as one example, leads to more questions about how effective restrictions are and have been in actually stopping the spread of the virus. Many families have also been affected by the heartbreaking limits on attendance at funerals, for example, whilst other areas of society have seemingly opened up. Now it seems we're going backwards and we're facing even further harsh restrictions. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, on the eve of these apparent further restrictions, can he say more about how the government is actually evaluating the evidence base for these restrictions, and how can the public, we welcome the parliamentary scrutiny, but how can the public expect to be kept informed, not just getting verbal updates through the media or in Parliament, but where can the public see written evidence and evaluation of these policy decisions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I just caution the member, I think, to question on the basis of what the word she uses, apparent changes. I think we should wait to hear what the First Minister has to say, and I don't think we should speculate upon that. Speculation is no doubt appropriate for the media. I don't think it's appropriate in the Chamber, given we do not know. Now, on the substance of the question, I just have to say that I'm sorry she didn't specifically welcome something for which she might have been able to take some of the credit, which was the Section 16 of the UK Act, which we've listened to the member and to others about that section, and we have taken action about it. And I pay credit to the member. She has questioned me, I think, twice or three times about that section, and it is important that we recognise that progress being made. In terms of information, nobody could say there was a shortage of published information on the issue of coronavirus. There's a vast amount of information, probably too much information. The regulations are clearly set out. The material on the websites is clearly set out. The First Minister answers in detail, including information on the scientific background every day, and still does so despite attempt by some to stop her doing so. She is accompanied very often by, for example, the clinical director of the National Health Service, sometimes by the Chief Medical Officer, and by others. There's a great deal of information, but we all also have a role to play. Each of us has a role to play, and that is to make sure we are familiar with the information and the science, which we can do, and then make sure we explain that carefully to people so that they understand what the situation is. Nobody is being asked to do anything except to take the actions which we genuinely believed, and the First Minister genuinely believes, will save lives and will take us through this as safely as possible. That is the motivation. And whilst we can no doubt debate the science, I don't think we should debate the motivation.
Thank you. And I'll call Rona Mackay to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Members understand that often changes need to be made at short notice in order to respond to a rapidly changing situation. I welcome the update the Cabinet Secretary provided in discussions with the Parliament on how further scrutiny can be enabled to happen at an earlier stage wherever possible. When does the Cabinet Secretary expect the first meeting to take place, and is there scope for engagement to continue over recess so that processes are in place when Parliament resumes?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, I'm not going anywhere, so I'm very happy to have as much engagement as we can possibly have. I have suggested to my office today, once the party leaders have responded, that we try and arrange a virtual meeting this week. These meetings will be virtual meetings. We try and arrange a virtual meeting this week. I know that my officials have already informally engaged with the Parliament, and we will look for ideas from the parties and the Parliament, and we will bring ideas to the table ourselves. I hope we could come to an early agreement about how we might do this, even in interim, so that we can then get on with the enhanced scrutiny. But the member is absolutely right to say we must remember these are regulations for a public health emergency, and therefore urgency is what underpins them. And we must therefore make sure that urgency goes alongside scrutiny and one does not trump the other.
Brian Whittle to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The statement indicates that the short-life mental health legislation may not have been utilised to any great extent, but the Scottish Government intends to retain said provisions as, I quote, it may leave services vulnerable if there is indeed a second wave of COVID-19. However, surely this service is not one that will be required at short notice, the Cabinet Secretary indicates, and it would be perfectly feasible to suspend this part of the legislation and bring it back if the Parliament requires. The Scottish Government should only retain those powers it will need to act on with any speed, and I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could comment.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm aware this is a difficult area, but I don't see much difference between suspending it and actually not operating it, and it has not been operated. But this decision is not made, as my statement indicates, by ministers alone. The Short-Life Mental Health Legislation Commencement Consideration Group looks at this issue. It consists of people from the Mental Welfare Commission, the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, somebody from the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland, somebody from the Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service, Social Work Scotland. There is considerable expertise around that table. And the view of that group, as recently as September the 9th, when they last met, was that this should remain on the statute book, but it has not yet been used, and we hope will not be used. But I think to go through the rigmarole of taking it off and bringing it back on would not be desirable. I think it would be, and we can talk about this in terms of enhanced scrutiny, it might, for example, be appropriate to ensure that in a provision such as this, advance notice was given if it was to be used, so that there could then be a discussion before it was used. But I think fiddling with the Act, it would not be a sensible thing to do. But I listen to people, and I'm listening to the advisers, but I'm also listening to the Chamber. And if we could find some way of ensuring more scrutiny of this, then I'd be comfortable with it. And I hope that the member accepts that genuinely.
Ruth Maguire to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Presiding Officer, in the Cabinet Secretary's last statement on coronavirus legislation, he outlined actions taken to account for the nature and number of incidents of domestic abuse occurring during the reporting period, and asked the Cabinet Secretary to outline how this work has informed the Government's consideration of the emergency legislation since the last reporting period, please.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I'm grateful to those members who very strongly supported this move, and I think Pauline McNeill was instrumental in bringing it to the Chamber, but others supported it very strongly indeed. I think what it has done is concentrated minds on the fact that this was not only something we feared might happen, but is actually happening, and therefore the interventions, and I've indicated that in my report, have been stepped up, including resource made available in these circumstances. I think that will continue. Those who have there's been increased funding of 4.25 million for organisations working on the front line to allow services to be upscaled, and this is kept under constant review. So this is an area where there's been a pretty quick feedback. I think it is also an area that does influence decision-making on what lies next, because we have to recognise that this appears to be a terrible thing, but actually a consequence of some of the lockdown, and therefore we should work very hard to make sure that we're trying to avoid circumstances repeating themselves. Both of those things are important.
Thank you. Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome the reference by the Cabinet Secretary of the importance of children's rights in his statement? Can he therefore confirm whether there will be an updated children's rights and wellbeing impact assessment, given the concerns expressed by both Bernardo's and the Children and Young People's Commissioner about the impact of the pandemic on children's rights? From my own casework, I am conscious of the impact of the loss of access to certain local services on children and young people's wellbeing and mental health. So I would very much appreciate an update from the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
I'm grateful to Sarah Boyack for that point. I'm quite happy to take to the relevant ministers, to the Deputy First Minister and to the Minister for Children, the suggestion that comes from herself and from the children's charities that additional work is required on this. The member is aware that we do try and keep the issue of rights at the centre of what we're trying to do, and I think therefore I would ask them to consider that. It will be what Sarah Boyack has said will be reported to them, to consider that and perhaps to come back to her directly.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks. Can I welcome Cabinet Secretary's statement, in particular his comments about enhanced scrutiny. And I think it's important we're not just looking back, but we're looking forward. Events that are foreseeable, such as Christmas, winter demand on the NHS. But in scrutinising the whole picture, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that we need oversight on those aspects which are outside of the regulations, such as the government's testing strategy, which may nevertheless have a strong bearing on the regulations themselves?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sure there are many things that the member would like to see further discussion and scrutiny of. That is what this Parliament is for. That is what the democracy is for. I have to say I am here to report on the legislation and the regulations. And the issue I am addressing in terms of scrutiny is focused entirely on the legitimate concerns which I've heard expressed by members of this chamber during First Minister's questions last week, I think, and the week before from Graham Simpson, for other members who has also been to the committee to raise these points, for other members, and that is what we are reflecting on. I am sure the member has many, many opportunities to raise other issues, testing and other issues, and if I may use a good Scottish word, I've not seen any member here blate at doing so.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very glad the Government have agreed to stand down powers under Section 16, but would ask that he reconsider disapplying them for children. The Conservative Government at Westminster have recognised that mental health regulations under Section 10 are no longer needed, that pressure on the health services will never be such that we need to dispense with the important safeguards of a second qualified mental health professional signing off on a detention order. Is he not concerned, as Brian Whittle suggested already, that for as long as these powers remain at the disposal of his government, that the human rights of mental health patients under the terms of UN Convention will be in peril?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I seem to recall a very similar question from the member during the last report, and I pointed out to him that, great admirer as I am of Mr Cole-Hamilton and many of the things he does, when I look for advice on mental health legislation, I look to the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists before I look to Mr Hamilton, which I would think is a fair judgment to make. In these circumstances, I've explained to Mr Whittle, and I think it's not an unhelpful explanation. He indicated as a reasonable man he was accepting that explanation. I'm sorry Mr Cole-Hamilton isn't accepting it. I think there could be a discussion. I think there should be a discussion as to whether the powers here would be used, and before they were used, there should be that discussion. And I'm quite happy to take that away. But if the Short Life Mental Health Legislation Commencement Consideration Group makes the recommendation, I think I would be likely to be massively criticised by Mr Cole-Hamilton and others were I not to pay attention to it.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We know and we've heard from questions already today that this emergency legislation is wide-ranging and the provisions affect a wide variety of policy areas. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide details as to how the Scottish Government arrives at the decision as to which provisions will be renewed and which will expire?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's a good question. Mr McGregor is right to ask how this is done. There's very extensive discussion almost from the moment one report is finished by, I have to say, a very talented team of officials who support me in this, with individual policy areas about their areas within the bills. And it starts with the assumption that they have to justify the continued presence of items within the legislation. And we start essentially on the basis that the sooner we can expire all of this, the better. And then there is a discussion after officials with ministers as to whether the recommendations to continue or not to continue are acceptable to them. And evidence is taken, discussions take place with stakeholders. It is a wide-ranging process. And so far, we've been able to suspend or withdraw a number of provisions. We hope to be able to continue to do so. But we are also faced with what the member sees, what this chamber sees, which is there is a resurgence of cases, there is evidence of the spread into older age groups, there is obviously from today's figures an increase in hospitalisation, there's an increase in people going into ICU. So we need to look at the provisions we've got and say, if we needed these 6 months ago, might we still need them? And if the answer is yes, then we need to think very carefully about what we do next. So this is also part of the process, this discussion. The fact that Mr Cameron's COVID committee will consider this report, and I shall be there, I hope, no doubt, to answer questions on this report, and the process will continue, and then we will be back here within 2 months continuing to do it.
Maurice Currie, to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary states in his statement that the Scottish Government's revision in the UK Act relating to mental health remain necessary. Are there any further provisions the Scottish Government is considering for mental health which it might have to take, and what would be the trigger to do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Currie's question is very appropriate. It is not possible for us to add things to this legislation. All we can do is subtract things from this legislation. So there are no new moves that we could take in this legislation. Whether there are things that could be done by regulation would be a moot point. I think in terms of mental health actions, we would be reluctant to take regulator secondary legislation for those purposes. So if we were to take new actions within the area of mental health to do with the pandemic, I suspect we might need new primary legislation, and we have no plans for further emergency legislation. But I don't want to be totally specific because I could imagine circumstances in which regulations could be used, but I'd be very surprised if they were to be used in these circumstances.
Richard Lyle, to be followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask how the Scottish Government balances keeping us safe whilst allowing individual freedom when reaching their decisions? Many people have had to cancel holidays over the last months, and possibly many more tomorrow. As this virus is not going away anytime soon, how can we move forward and not constantly go into lockdown that only suppresses the virus but doesn't eradicate it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I just want to caution the member, as I cautioned another member, not to speculate on what may or may not be happening. I think the First Minister was very clear at her briefing today. She said it was not a lockdown. You know, she was not anticipating a lockdown. So let's be very clear about the language we used. The member is right about balance. There is a constant balance to be struck, and that balance is complex, and it becomes more complex as time goes on, because after 6.5, 7 months, things have changed. People are weary. We are all weary. All of us want to protect lives. All of us want to help our fellow citizens. But equally, we are concerned about damage being done to our businesses, to our friends' businesses, as constituency members, to our constituency. I have a constituency, for example, that has many islands in it and a great deal of tourism, and I do not wish to see any further damage. There's been considerable damage done, and I want to mitigate that if possible. So all those matters are borne in mind, and the First Minister indicated that the Cabinet met this morning for a lengthy discussion of where we are now, and there's considerable discussion. The First Minister talks constantly to her advisers, reads, listens. We all do. But in the end, decisions have to be made. And when decisions are made, and I hope the Chamber will be part of the process and the committees will be part of the process of thinking this through, sometimes decisions have to be made quickly and have to be implemented quickly if we are to make a difference. And that, of course, is a hard thing, and it's a responsibility that the government has to take.
Anas Sarwar, to be followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I agree with the Cabinet Secretary that speculation is not a good thing, but we've had 2 weeks of active speculation, encouraged by members of the government or their advisers. We've had a back and forth on the so-called circuit breaker, and I think it is important, like the government said at the outset of this virus, that we should treat the public as grown-ups, particularly if we want to make sure that we keep up compliance and maintain public support for the actions of this Parliament and of this government. I also welcome what he says about added scrutiny. I know that's a conversation that him and I have had from right at the start of this pandemic, and I think more scrutiny would be welcome. But fundamentally, can we accept that the science can only go so far? Ultimately, this will come down to judgment calls, and when it comes to judgment calls, there should be greater scrutiny, greater discussion, greater debate, and therefore help take the public with us going forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as ever with Anas Sarwar, I agree with a great deal of what he said, and I disagree with some bits of what he said. So let me try and get the agreement bit through first of all. I do think we need to have more scrutiny. We've made that clear. I want Mr Sarwar and others to understand, as I'm sure he does, the real need to act urgently and the need to make sure things are done and you can't hang about. But equally, I understand and very much understand that we should try and develop something new, because we need a new procedure for this. There's no existing procedure in this Parliament that would allow this to happen. We need a new procedure, and that shouldn't be beyond us, to make sure that we can do things well and properly. On the disagreement part, I mean, I do think that we would go into semantics here. There's a difference between discussion and speculation. He used the word discussion. You know, if a minister is asked a question and wants to inform people and answers that question, that's not necessarily speculation. What I'm just discouraging is at jumping. Perhaps I should refine my words, as I know Mr Sarwar likes precision in language as in all things. I think what I'm asking people to do is not to jump to conclusions about what's taking place, but to remain open-minded. And I'm sure, like every member of this chamber, he will be open-minded.
Final question, Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, in your statement you mentioned 7 core principles, and one of which is dignity, which is very important, but particularly important to older people. So can I therefore ask what engagement will be undertaken with organisations and groups supporting older people on the impact of this legislation?
Cabinet Secretary.
There continues to be discussion with many stakeholders, and I'm sure that the officials responsible for the areas of this special legislation that affect older people are in touch with those organisations. I know that the Health Secretary, for example, is in regular contact with organisations and individuals representing relatives of those in the care home sector, for example, and making sure that we're listening and understanding the very, very, very difficult situation that many people are faced with and how they respond to that. Sandra White knows the commitment of the Scottish Government to as much consultation and discussion as possible. That will apply to this area as every area.
Thank you very much. That completes questions on the statement, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business.